Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula, and we survived a wet and wild Australian Grand Prix, and now, Zach, it's full speed ahead to our first sprint weekend.
Yeah, I mean, what a crazy race to start the season on. I don't think it could have been any more chaotic. Realistically, at the minute, from some teams, if you just scored some points, you're doing pretty decent.
And Zach, I remember the noises I was making on my couch at the end of that race when we saw Oscar Piastri spinning his tires on the grass. That could have been the end of our whole season in one fall swoop. So I'm really glad that worked out for us.
Completely agree.
And if you had a tough week in fantasy, remember, even Sauber's ahead of Ferrari in the constructor standings right now. So it's a long season. Things are going to change. Just stay patient and things will turn around for you soon. Now remember, before we start things today, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss our F1 fantasy content all season long. So Zach, I want to get into price changes first. Do you want to explain how the price change formula is going to work for 2025 and how we can harness that to build our team's price?
Yeah, so especially for the first three races, which we're still in, it's still working a little bit different. But the thresholds are always going to stay the same, with terrible being less than 0.2, poor being 0.2 to 0.3, good being 0.3 to 0.4, and great being 0.4 or above. So you'll see it in the likes of Piastri and Behrman, but we'll go with Piastri for now. Obviously, he got 10 points in Australia, but with the way it's going, and because F1 Fantasy had 0 points, considering they go from a free race analysis, but obviously there's been no races for Australia, that meant he got 0 plus 0 plus 10, which meant he was under that 0.2 threshold. And that's why you saw Piastri get that 0.3 million decrease. Now, going into China, that obviously is going to be a little bit easier to hit that threshold because we're going off more than just one race in that at free average. However, it does make it a lot harder for drivers who DNF'd, as now you've got a minus 20 with them before they even hit to China, which means quite a few drivers will probably just be going down no matter what their score is, especially on the cheap assets of minus 0.6. However, you could see the opposite with the likes of Hulkenberg, Stroll and Albon probably going up 0.6 if they just don't crash out, because, again, they scored so big, it would literally take negative points for them to not.
And I know this is one of the most debated topics in F1 fantasy this week because we had 9 drivers and 4 constructors lose the maximum of 0.6 million. So we need to figure out how to right the ship for China and how we can take advantage of knowing this cost cap algorithm to really build our cost caps for the rest of the season. Because as Andrew, our 2024 champion, showed us, if you invest early and build that team's value, you can run super teams later in the season. So it's good to pay attention now. All right, as we get ready for this weekend, there are 2 chips that really stand out to me. Obviously, Wildcard is one that's going to be very popular this weekend because a lot of teams didn't hit the nail on the head with their Australia lineup, and they're just going to want to hit the full reset button. This allows you to make unlimited free transfers to your team so that you can completely shuffle the deck, get the right lineup in for China, and take advantage of some of those price gainers, as Zach mentioned just a moment ago.
I'd like to add as well, the reason it could be so powerful at this point of the season is because of what I mentioned before with the free race average. You've now got such swings that I've already mentioned about, with the 0.6s and the 0.3s already sort of being known before we've even raced at China, meaning you could have massive swings if you do use a wild card now, which later down the line, when we've actually got 3 races to go off, it's going to be a lot harder to get those massive swings. So wild card will be less useful, potentially.
And Zach has some really brilliant ideas of how to use this wild card to maximize our price gaining later in the show. So I can't wait for you all to see some of those too. Now, another big chip for me this week is Limitless. Now, we had big points in 2024 at this circuit. 456 is what the top teams got in China last season. A sprint weekend, we obviously have 3 scoring events that we can accumulate points on. So it's another reason to use these chips on a sprint weekend. And China also had the second most overtakes in a Grand Prix after Las Vegas. So there are a ton of points on the table for this weekend. But one thing I want to mention too, if you use the Limitless chip, price changes at the end of China are based on your Australia lineups. So if you had a lot of negative points and price decreases after Australia, you might want to hold off on using the Limitless chip because you'll lose more value again after China. If you want to know more about these chips, we just dropped our chip guides on fanamp.com/fantasy, and our Limitless video is available on this channel too, so be sure you check it out. All right, Zach, let's move on to our tier ranks. There's been some changes since Australia, especially because of some of those price changes. Could you walk us through some of the biggest winners and losers after last week?
So the biggest winner has to be 100% McLaren as a constructor. I'll talk about them first, purely because obviously Norris got that driver of the day and fastest lap. So you can sort of see where I'm going with the McLaren constructor. The other one is Lando Norris. They both are pretty set in stone for those budget increases. And also, it's a really weird situation we've got ourselves into for China where I can't really tell you what the second best constructor is, which for F1 Fantasy is quite annoying. Well, depending on whatever team you're running. But it sort of means you have to have McLaren because Ferrari, they're not going to be scoring you enough points to challenge McLaren from what it looks like. And the same applies to the Mercedes and to the Red Bulls. So you're going to be seeing a lot of teams now going over to those McLaren builds. Now, you've also got George Russell, who really is the only other A-tier asset, which I know a lot of teams could be looking at because at the minute, if you've got some pricing correct, you could fit in Piastri and McLaren to your team. However, if you want to bring in some better budgeting potentially, then you could also look at George Russell, who didn't look too shabby as well in that Mercedes. It looks like he's the most safe other option for the A-tier drivers. Now, on the sell side, you've got the likes of both Ferraris. They didn't really look like they knew what they were doing. It just doesn't look good over at Ferrari, so I'd be steering clear of them for now. And also Verstappen, it's not really to do with his points as per se, but considering he's close to Norris on points and he practically got half the points Norris got in Australia, you can see why you wouldn't go for Verstappen. And then Red Bull as a constructor, Liam Lawson's really letting the team down, and it's a shame for him, but I think it's going to carry on that way.
I totally agree with you with this Tier A breakdown, but one thing that I'm going to keep an eye out for with McLaren is that there's some rumors at the early part of the week that the FIA is going to crack down on flexi wings and have a directive ahead of China. Now, the beauty of a sprint weekend is that we get to see sprint qualifying before we set our lineups, so I want to make sure in FP1 and in sprint qualifying that McLaren are still looking so strong and that this directive hasn't hit them negatively. But otherwise, I need to find a way to get at least one, if not two, McLaren assets on my team.
I'd like to say as well, on that sprint qualifying aspect, just to show how powerful this is, knowing your sprint qualifying results before team deadlines, it's very much, as I'll give you a sneak peek into what I'm thinking, it's very much I've got potentially two-ish teams on my mind, and depending on the sprint quali, I'll go for one or the other.
And this is what made China so strong for the Limitless chip last season. We knew who some of the top 5 drivers were in F1 Fantasy. They qualified for the sprint 2 or 3 places each, a little bit lower than we thought they would. And then we opted into the Limitless chip because we knew they would gain those positions back and get us an even bigger point total. So keep an eye out on those sprint quality results. We'll definitely break it down on our live show and help you pivot into the right team for you this weekend. Zach, let's head over to Tier B. And obviously, everyone that had a strong race in Australia is looking at another 0.6 million value increase this week. So I'd load up on there as much as possible. I've got Hulkenberg, Ocon, Albon. They were all P10 through P12 in this race last season. So I think they'll have another good week in China and also a good cost cap growing week. But then also Kimi Antonelli really impressed us finishing right after George Russell last week in Australia. So he could be on for another great week as well.
Yeah, he did absolutely phenomenal, and I was quite taken aback. I thought he'd be good, but that good? Incredible. For me, I think he did deserve driver of the day. Maybe it's because I wasn't running the Norris build, so I'm a little bit biased. But well done, Kimi Antonelli. He's definitely one to look at.
And I think a lot of people are going to opt into Kimi Antonelli with the wild card this week because he allows you to afford almost all of these big Tier B price gainers. Whereas most typical builds where you'll have Norris or Piastri or George Russell as your 2X driver, you can only afford 2 or 3 of them, and you'll probably have to take a hit on one driver, such as an Isaac Hadjar, that'll lose value this week. So the Antonelli build is really helpful for price gaining.
I'd like to talk about some of our on-the-fence drivers in the B tier as well, and the other one is Carlos Sainz. Now, this is an interesting one because, sadly for Carlos Sainz, most likely, like quite a few of the B tier assets, he probably will get a negative price change after China, no matter what he does. However, we're just thinking a lot more for Sainz on the points, and Williams looked very good, and with him dropping in price, it means that you could jump on him purely for points. And it's the sort of similar situation for a lot of the B tier assets. You go over to the sell option. Now, do I think all of these drivers will actually be dreadful? in China? No, I think Gasly would be fine. Alonso would be fine on points. Hadjar, Bortoleto, we see what they could do. It's just they're all bound, basically, bar Gasly, bound for that minus zero point 0.6 again, which I really can't overlook. Because for a lot of people, a lot of their teams would have lost a lot of value come after Australia. And we're looking at potentially even more value lost if you kept some of these in your team.
I'm really licking my chops, though, for some of these prices going into Japan. If we have price decreases in 2 consecutive weeks for some of these assets, Sainz, Alonso, and Yuki Tsunoda could be really cheap by the time Japan comes around, and we could have some great value plays moving on after the Asian series.
And then one constructor to think about on the B tier side is realistically Haas on the fence purely if you are going for pure budget. And that's because they're one of the other constructors who didn't get any negative points. And if you really can't squeeze in that Williams into the build, that would be the next best option purely for budget. Williams-wise, that would still be the best B tier asset to bring in constructor-wise. Oh, and I really like this first team coming up. It does look really juicy just for points. Maybe not budget, but points. Wowee.
So as we bring it all together and try to figure out which lineups will be the best for China this week, Zach is already drooling over this first one, trying to get a piece of McLaren in 2 ways, both with the 2X driver and Piastri and with the McLaren constructor. We're going to take a little bit of a hit with some of those cheaper drivers because multiple drivers are due to get a price decrease, but I really like what this does for points.
I'd like to say with this team as well, there is no proper reason for me to bring in Hadjar over Bortoleto. It really is just whichever one, for me, probably after sprint qualifying, looks better.
Moving on to team number 2, and I think for the wild card, this one really stands out to me because 6 out of 7 assets right now, according to F1 Fantasy Tools, are slated to gain value this week. You get Norris and McLaren, so there's lots of points upside there. The pace of the Williams looks real, so they'll be nice and sturdy for you. And then Behrman, Stroll, and Hulkenberg all coming off of positive weeks last week at Australia, looking to gain some value in China.
And it really does show with these first few teams, it does depend solely on which McLaren looks better. Because we've seen now with how dominant McLaren look as they could be, if Piastri can hold on to Norris, it would be completely fine because Mercedes would build up a big enough gap to Williams points-wise to score better. But if Norris really is going to be dominating, at least for the first few races, in China sprint race, even more points on offer, then you can't not look away from Lando Norris. And that obviously would then mean you bring in Williams. However, like we mentioned, they could potentially be on for a 0.6 million increase in budget. So you could get great budget and similar or more points to the first team. So it very much looks like a very well-rounded team for now.
And also something was very telling from Australia is that Lando got driver of the day despite incredible drives from Alex Albon and Kimi Antonelli. So whatever magic Lando has to try to get that fan vote for driver of the day, it's carried over into this year. And I think he could get us an additional 10 points times 2 if he's your 2X driver this week in China as well.
So going into this team, now, funnily enough, it's not one I would recommend fully going for just because sprint race, like we just mentioned, more points on offer. However, let's say you have had a dramatically dreadful start to Australia and you just need a full-on bounce back coming in to, well, China and then going into Japan. Well, this team here, I kid you not, we were talking about how 6 of the 7 assets are due for an increase in the other team. This one, all of them. Bar Behrman, because he technically got a 0.6 million drop, but he did well enough where if the average works out, he's not going to drop a lot and potentially still could get a 0.2 million increase. So there is a real scenario where this team, yes, it's not going to score you crazy amount of points with Haas as assets. However, still having Norris and McLaren, you are going to potentially get around 3 million in price increases for your team.
Ooh, triple Haas, prepare for the heartburn. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's going to hurt points-wise.
And then for those of you who are thinking about using the Limitless chip, this is as good as we've got for right now. Norris, Piastri, Verstappen, Leclerc, Russell, McLaren, and Ferrari. Now, obviously, Russell and Ferrari, you could flex them out. Russell into Hamilton, Ferrari into Red Bull or Mercedes, depending on how sprint qualifying looks. But this is a pretty super team for the second week of the season.
Yeah, 100% agree. It's very much going to come down to a lot of sprint qualifying. Realistically, it's always just for the driver-wise. Oh, let's look at the top 5, see what they're doing. Unless we have a situation where Norris is all the way down in P18 because he screwed up his first lap sort of thing, because then you get a lot of overtake and position gain points if he didn't crash.
Now let's look at the scores from our fan amp picks from Australia, and it looks like, Zach, you won this week. Congratulations.
Yay! Yeah, my predictions were okay. Some of them were very off, but it was one of those weekends, wasn't it? It was so hard to predict. We're going to see a lot more points, I think, on behalf of all of us coming into China.
Yesterday, I went and looked back through my picks to see who I went with on Saturday to try to get the most points possible, and I was appalled at what I saw. So I need to do better work in China this weekend. And if you want to play along with Zach, Terry, and myself, make sure you head on over to the Fan Amp app. We're giving away a prize from Fifth Gear Garms each and every week, and the winner at the end of every sector gets a special prize too. So be sure you check it out. And the winner of that prize last week was Saul Zander. So congratulations to you, Saul. And take a look at our league. We've got over 40,000 teams playing along with us. And so if you haven't joined, make sure you check out our featured league on F1.com today.
And if you take a look at some of the points, this is very much a case of don't be too disheartened after your rank of Australia, as a lot of these teams would have used potentially Limitless, extra DRS to be at the front for the first race. So let's say you're below the top 500,000 or even more than that. It's a long season ahead. You are going to do good. Remember that.
Zach, Terry, and I will be back this weekend at a time we haven't decided yet, but we're going to post in the comments as soon as we do. So make sure you keep an eye out for that and join us this weekend as we answer all of your questions ahead of the sprint race for the Chinese Grand Prix. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you this weekend.
Take care.